The letter arrived on a morning when the weather was doing that irritating thing where it couldn't decide between rain and sun, so it chose both, leaving everything wet and bright and somehow offensive. I was eating cereal over my kitchen sink. The way people eat cereal when they've given up on the performance of sitting at a table. When my phone buzzed against the laminate countertop, I almost didn't check it. My inbox at that point was mostly coupon alerts and passive-aggressive emails from my landlord about the recycling bins. Nothing that required urgent attention. Nothing that mattered. But I checked it, because I always check it, because I am a person who is constitutionally incapable of ignoring the small red notification bubble, and so I read the subject line. Congratulations, Mr. Cook. We are pleased to offer you a summer internship position at Burns & Associates. I stared at that email for a long time. Long enough for my cereal to go soggy. Long enough for the sun to lose the argument with the clouds and retreat entirely, leaving the kitchen gray and still. Burns & Associates. The firm, the one that had been on my vision board. Which is an embarrassing thing to admit that I had a vision board. That I was 23 years old and still taping printouts of prestigious architectural firms to a corkboard above my desk like some kind of aspirational teenager. But it was there. The logo. The address. The names of the partners listed on the website, each one a small monument to everything I wanted to become. And now they were offering me an internship. I put my phone face down on the counter. I picked up my cereal bowl. I poured it into the sink and watched it drain and tried to feel something clean and uncomplicated like joy. What I actually felt was suspicious. My name is Elmer Cook. Elmer, like the glue, like the cartoon character with the speech impediment who hunts rabbits and never catches them. I had been introduced at job fairs, at networking events, at the kinds of informal professional gatherings where you wear a blazer but drink beer, and watch the flicker behind people's eyes when they read my name badge. Not cruelty exactly, just a small recalibration. Oh, Elmer. But here was the thing about Burns & Associates. The thing that made my suspicious feeling sharpen into something more specific. The founding partner, the name on the letterhead. The man whose aesthetic vision had shaped the firm's reputation across nearly 2 decades of practice was Leonard Burns. Leonard. Like the name Elmer, it was the kind of name that came with a certain weight, a certain era, the kind of name that showed up in old novels and on the nameplates of professors who wore corduroy. My grandfather had been an Elmer. Leonard Burns's father, I would later learn, had been a Leonard too. There was a small, shameful part of me that wondered if my name had gotten me the interview. If some algorithmic or human quirk had flagged the application of an Elmer Cook and routed it to a desk where a Leonard Burns had leaned back in his chair and felt for reasons neither of us could have articulated. A faint kinship. I almost emailed back to decline. I didn't. Of course I didn't. I was 23 and broke and deeply in love with architecture, and Burns & Associates had just offered me a summer that could change everything. So I typed my acceptance with my jaw set and my pride tucked into my back pocket, where I could pretend it wasn't there, and I pressed send. And I went to find a blazer that didn't look like it had been stored in a bag of chips. The firm's offices were on the 7th floor of a building that the firm itself had designed, which felt like the architectural equivalent of a cat cleaning its own fur. Elegant and slightly unsettling. The lobby was all clean lines and honey-colored wood and the kind of natural light that made you feel both calmed and evaluated simultaneously. I arrived 9 minutes early, which was late enough to seem like I hadn't tried too hard and early enough to seem like I respected other people's time. I had practiced this balance with the care of someone defusing a device. The receptionist's name was Priya, and she smiled at me with the patient warmth of someone who had greeted approximately 11,000 nervous interns. Elmer Cook? That's me. Mr. Burns will be with you in just a moment. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Water would be great, thank you. I sat in one of the lobby chairs, which were low and beautifully uncomfortable in the way that expensive design sometimes is, and looked at the building's cross-section model mounted on the far wall. Even from here, I could see the thought in it, the way the atrium breathed, the way the vertical garden interrupted the glass facade. The small decisions that added up to something that felt inevitable even though nothing about good design is ever inevitable. I was still looking at it when someone came to stand beside me. The planned wall was a mistake. I looked up. The man standing there was maybe 15 years older than me in the vicinity of late 30s, with the kind of face that suggested it had started handsome and then been improved by time and weather and thinking hard about things. Dark circles under gray eyes, a jaw that hadn't been shaved quite recently enough. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and looking at the model with an expression that was half fond and half rueful. The concept was right, he continued, seemingly unbothered by the fact that I hadn't responded yet. Living wall, vertical ecosystem brings the outside in. The execution was the problem. Irrigation, the whole third floor smelled like wet soil for 6 months. But it looked right, I offered, because it had, and I wasn't in the habit of letting inaccurate criticism stand even when it was delivered by someone who appeared to be significantly more important than me. He looked at me then. Not a flicker, not a recalibration. Just a look. Yes, he said. It looked exactly right. He put out his hand. Leonard Burns. My name was in my throat, but I managed to get it out without dropping it. Elmer Cook. Something moved across his face, not the thing I was used to, the small involuntary registration of my name's eccentricity. Something else, closer to recognition. Of course, he said. Come on back. The internship was supposed to be administrative. That's what the offer letter had said. Administrative support, research assistance, filing and document management, the understated language that meant someone needed an organized person to do the work that no one else wanted to do. Within 3 days, Leonard Burns had me in a design review meeting. This was not standard. The other intern, a composed young woman named Sasha, who had gone to a far better school than me and wore her competence like a second outfit, had not been in any design review meetings. She had told me this with a neutrality that I chose to interpret as diplomatic rather than pointed. The meeting was about a community center project, mid-sized, tight budget, a neighborhood that had been promised something for a long time, and was beginning to suspect the promise would calcify into a rendering nobody ever built. 5 architects around a conference table, and Leonard Burns at the head of it, and me against the wall with a notepad because someone had remembered at the last moment that someone should be taking notes. I took notes, but I also listened, and what I heard was a problem that nobody at the table seemed to be naming out loud. They were trying to make the building look generous when the budget made it actually small. They were trying to use materials to suggest more space than the footprint offered. This is a legitimate architectural strategy, and sometimes it works beautifully. But in this case, the section drawings were wrong. The ceiling heights in the main hall were doing 2 different things at once. They were trying to soar and trying to be economical, and the result was a space that would feel neither open nor intimate but would instead achieve the rare architectural feat of feeling simultaneously cramped and unfinished. I wrote this down on my notepad, then looked at what I'd written, then turned the page and started drawing. I drew quickly, the way you draw when you're thinking rather than presenting. Loose lines that weren't meant for anyone's eyes. I drew an alternative section, dropped the main hall ceiling, used the height differential to create a mezzanine for the library component that had been orphaned on the 2nd floor. Let the double height space happen at the entry instead, where it would do more work for less money. I was so absorbed in the drawing that I didn't notice the meeting had gone quiet until the quality of the silence reached me. Leonard Burns was standing at my shoulder. I had not heard him get up. I had not heard him cross the room. He was simply there. The way certain presences make themselves known without announcement, and he was looking at my notepad. My face felt like it was happening in a different postal code than the rest of my body. "May I?" He reached for the notepad without waiting for my answer, which was either presumptuous or simply the behavior of someone who already knew what the answer would be. He carried the notepad back to the table and set it flat where everyone could see it. The room looked at my drawing. I looked at the room, looking at my drawing. My pen was still in my hand and I was gripping it with slightly more force than necessary. "The mezzanine," said one of the senior architects slowly. Her name was Margot, and she had been in the firm for 12 years, and she looked at things with the calibrated patience of someone who had learned to let ideas land before reacting to them. "It solves the library problem," said someone else. "And the entry sequence," said someone else. Leonard Burns picked up the notepad again and looked at me across the conference table. "Did you sketch this during the meeting?" "Yes." "While you were taking notes?" "I was doing both." A pause and then the edge of something on his face that I would have called a smile if it had been slightly less restrained. "All right," he said to the room. "Let's pull the section up on screen and talk about this properly." He handed the notepad back to me on his way to the display panel. His fingers were warm where they briefly contacted the edge of the paper. I noted this. I filed this information in the part of my mind labeled things that are irrelevant and also somehow not irrelevant at all. The dynamic that established itself over the following weeks was one I did not have a precise vocabulary for. I was an intern. Leonard Burns was the founding partner. These facts remained factual. He did not pretend they were otherwise, and neither did I. He did not treat me with false equality or the exhausting performance of mentorship, where someone asks you questions they already know the answer to in order to make you feel like you've discovered something. He treated me like someone who had opinions that were occasionally useful and sometimes inconvenient and worth listening to either way. He would leave drawings on my desk, not instructions. Just drawings, with a note that said things like, "Something's wrong with this and I can't figure out what." Look at it. I would look at it. Sometimes I could find what was wrong. Sometimes I couldn't, and I would write that down too, because I had already learned that pretending to have found something when you hadn't was far more costly than admitting the limit. Once I wrote, "I don't think it's wrong. I think you're bored with it, which is a different problem." I left the note on his desk and then spent approximately 45 minutes waiting for the consequence. The consequence was that he appeared in the doorway of the intern workspace and looked at me with an expression I had to work to read. "You might be right," he said finally. "That's an annoying thing to be right about." "I know." "Are you always this direct?" I considered the question. "With work, yes. With other things, I'm sometimes less direct than I should be." He absorbed this. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to his office, and I breathed for the first time in what felt like several geological epochs. There was a colleague who took issue with me. His name was Derek, and he had been with the firm for 3 years, and he was good, genuinely technically skilled, the kind of architect who could produce construction documents of a precision that bordered on the obsessive. But he was also the kind of person who organized the world into categories of threat and non-threat, and interns were supposed to be firmly in the second category, and I had apparently migrated without his permission. The jabs were small, the kind that are impossible to formally object to. Comments in meetings about the importance of experience. Questions about my technical background phrased in tones that were just shy of patronizing. Once during a project review, he had gestured to a detail I had worked on and said in a voice of perfectly calibrated neutrality, "Interesting approach given the constraints," which translated from architect to plain language as, "I would not have done it this way, and I am implying that my way would have been better." I let most of it move through me. I was an intern. I was young. I was there to learn and to contribute what I could and not to win arguments with people who had been in the field longer than I had. But the afternoon he made the comment about my education, specifically the remark that some programs are better known for conceptual enthusiasm than technical rigor. I put down my pen very carefully and looked at him. "I'm happy to talk through the technical decisions if there are specific concerns," I said. "What's the detail you'd like to revisit?" He blinked. "I don't have a specific concern, I just think." "If you don't have a specific concern, then I think we're fine," I said with the same tone of perfectly calibrated neutrality he'd been using on me, and I picked up my pen again. He didn't say anything else. He left the room, and I went back to work. And my hands were slightly steadier than they had been 2 minutes ago, which told me something about the energy I'd been spending holding that composure in place. Leonard Burns, I learned later, had been in the hallway. He had heard enough. He didn't say anything to me about it that day. But 2 days later, Derek was assigned to the infrastructure documentation project, which was important work and also entirely removed from the community center. And the change had not been accidental. The thing about noticing someone, the real noticing, the kind that accumulates quietly and then one day is simply present in your awareness like furniture you've always owned, is that it doesn't announce itself. It builds in increments too small to track. I noticed that Leonard Burns took his coffee black and let it go cold before he remembered to drink it. I noticed that he kept the window in his office cracked even on cold days. I noticed that he laughed at unexpected things. Not the jokes that were designed to be funny, but the observations that were slightly off-center, the small absurdities of daily professional life that most people let pass unremarked. I noticed that he listened in a particular way, with his eyes slightly averted, like he was focusing on the words themselves rather than the face that produced them, and that this was not inattention but its opposite. I noticed that when he stood at a window, and he stood at windows a lot, the architect's habit of looking at how light moved through space, There was a quality of stillness about him that seemed to cost him nothing. Most people in stillness were performing stillness. His appeared to be his natural state, the condition he returned to between demands. I noticed all of this and wrote none of it down, and kept it in a part of my mind that I visited, with the frequency of someone checking on a plant. Too much would be uncomfortable, but neglect felt irresponsible. What I was slower to notice was what he noticed about me. The first time I caught it, we were working late. This had become a pattern by week 4. The project demands pulling us both toward the end of the day. The office emptying around us. The particular quality of evening light on the drawings and models spread across the conference table. The other architects left by 6 or 7. By 8 it was usually just the two of us and occasionally Margot, who was the kind of person who defined her working hours by what the work required rather than what the clock said. That night, Margot had left at 7. Leonard Burns and I were at opposite ends of the conference table, working through separate aspects of the community center's revised scheme. I was looking at the entry sequence. The problem with the entry sequence, which I had introduced by suggesting the double height volume there, was that the transition from outside to inside felt abrupt. There was a threshold moment missing. I was trying to find it in the drawings, to locate the exact place where the architecture should pause and let the person arriving have a moment before the space declared itself. I found it, a small covered zone between the outer door and the inner lobby, just large enough to be an experience rather than a passage. A roof light above it, narrow, directing a single line of skylight downward. The roof bristle continuing past the threshold, making the outside and inside continuous in that one strip of ceiling. So you knew you had crossed, but the building didn't announce it with a flourish. I sketched it quickly, made a note, looked up to say something about it, and found Leonard Burns looking at me. Not at the drawings, at me. There was enough distance between us that I could pretend I hadn't noticed the direction of his gaze, and for a moment I considered doing exactly that. Instead I said, "What?" "Nothing," he said, immediately returning his attention to his work. "That's a very specific kind of nothing." A pause. He set his pencil down. "You were thinking," he said at last, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before, something slightly more unguarded than his usual register. "I could see the moment you found it, whatever it was." I found the threshold moment for the entry. "Show me." I slid the sketch across the table. He looked at it for a long time. "Yes," he said softly, "that's it." He slid it back, but his fingers rested on the paper a moment longer than required, and I noticed that too, and filed it in the same place. I filed everything else. A week later, he asked me where my name came from. We were eating lunch. This was also a pattern. He had taken to eating lunch at his desk, and I had taken to eating lunch in the intern workspace with its particular view of the building's light well. And at some point in week 3, he had started stopping by the light well window himself, coffee in hand, and these lunches had gradually merged into shared lunches without either of us formally proposing the arrangement. "My grandfather," I said. "He was also Elmer. My parents thought it was a tribute. I'd been reassessing the concept of tribute ever since." "What was he like, your grandfather?" "Enormous. Not physically. He was actually quite small, but enormous in the way some people are, where they fill whatever room they're in without trying. He had strong opinions about weather and cooking and the correct way to approach a problem, and he was right about all of them with an irritating frequency." Leonard Burns was quiet for a moment. "My father was a Leonard. I'm Leonard II technically." "Did you know him well?" "He died when I was 11. I knew him the way children know parents. Completely and incompletely. All the important things, and none of the details." He looked at the light well. "I became an architect partly because of a building he took me to when I was 8. He'd read about it somewhere and decided we had to go. 3-hour drive. We stood in front of it for 20 minutes and then he said, 'Someone made that,' and we drove home." I sat with this. "That's it? Just someone made that? That's it." But the way he said it, a pause. It was like he was handing me something. The light well was doing its thing. The slow, late afternoon drift of sun down the concrete shaft, and I watched it for a moment, and then watched him. Watching it, and something in my chest did a thing I wasn't prepared for. "Elmer," I said, because I felt the need to say something that wasn't directly related to any of this, was also a builder. He renovated the family house 3 times, not because it needed it, because he kept seeing how it could be better. Leonard Burns turned from the light well and looked at me. "That sounds familiar." I thought it might. We looked at each other across the remnants of our lunches, and I became aware that I was in territory I had not mapped, that the coordinates here were different from any place I had been before, and that the most honest thing I could do was acknowledge that I did not yet know the terrain. "I should get back to the section drawings," I said. "Yes," he agreed. And there was a quality to his agreement that suggested he was not only agreeing about the drawings. The problem with knowing something before you're ready to know it is that you can't unknow it. You can ignore it, suppress it, translate it into other languages. Ambition, admiration, professional regard, the particular electricity of collaboration with someone whose mind moves in ways you find consistently surprising. But the original fact remains. I was 23, he was 38, he was my supervisor in any meaningful sense of the word. I was in his building on his invitation, and my departure at the end of summer was already scheduled on some mental calendar I'd been maintaining since the beginning. These were facts, and they were important facts, and I arranged them in a row like evidence. On the other side of the evidence were other things that resisted the category of fact. The way he laughed at my off-center observations, the way he asked my opinion on things that had nothing to do with the internship, a book he was reading, a building he'd visited, the relative merits of the neighborhood coffee shop versus the machine in the break room, the way the room had a different quality when he was in it, and not simply because he was the partner whose approval determined my professional future. I was not someone who fell easily. I want to be clear about this. I was not a person who manufactured feelings in order to have them. I had been in one serious relationship before in the second year of my degree with someone whose name I could still think without complication. And it had ended with the kind of mutual recognition that we were good together in the ways that were easy and not good together in the ways that mattered. I knew the difference between a person who interested me and a person who moved something in me that was not easily named. Leonard Burns moved something in me that was not easily named. I sat with this for 2 weeks. I sat with it during project reviews and lunch at the Lightwell and late evenings at the conference table. I sat with it during the morning when he came in looking like he hadn't slept and made 3 wrong turns on his way to his own office and said to no one in particular that the ventilation in the building was thinking against him. I sat with it and I did not act on it, and I did not intend to act on it, because there are feelings you have the right to feel without having the right to impose them on someone who has not invited them. What changed was not a revelation. There was no moment of sudden clarity. What changed was cumulative, and the accumulation eventually exceeded the container I'd built for it. It was a Friday in the 6th week of my internship. Late afternoon, the kind where the light turns everything gold and slightly unreliable. I had been working on the community center's material specifications and had reached a decision point about the floor treatment in the main hall, and the decision point required knowing which direction Leonard Burns wanted to go with the budget. And so I went to his office. The door was half open. I knocked on the frame. "Come in." He was at his drafting table. The actual physical drafting table that occupied one corner of his office like a relic, and was I had come to understand where he did the work that mattered most to him. The early thinking, the felt-tip lines that preceded everything else. He had his back to me, pencil in hand, and I could see from the angle of his shoulder that he was deep in something. "I can come back." "No, stay." He set the pencil down and turned around. "What is it?" I explained the floor treatment question. He listened the way he listened, eyes slightly averted, focused on the words, and then he walked me through the budget logic, the flexibility available in that line item, the finish he'd been considering and why he had reservations about it. And then he said, "Do you have an opinion?" "I always have an opinion." "Then give it." I gave it. I told him I thought the floor was doing too many things, trying to be durable and beautiful and economical all at once, and that you could achieve 2 of those things well, or 3 of them poorly. And my recommendation was to commit fully to durable and economical and let the beauty come from the light and the proportions rather than the finish. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. "That's right," he said, and his voice was different in the way it sometimes got different, the register that existed underneath his professional one, lower and less guarded. "That's the right call." There was a pause. The gold afternoon light was doing its thing through the window he kept cracked, and the city outside was making its city noises. And Leonard Burns was looking at me with the expression that I had been filing under things to examine later. Elmer, my name in his voice was doing something I hadn't prepared for. He said it like it meant something specific, like it was a word that had a definition he knew and was using deliberately. Yes, you've been here 6 weeks. Yes, you've been here 6 weeks. Yes, you are. He stopped. Started again. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? A small exhale, almost a laugh. Someone who would be useful for the summer. Someone who would learn things, do competent work, go back to school with a letter of reference and some experience. That's what internships are. And that's not what this has been. That's not what this has been. He picked up his pencil, then set it down again. The action of a person managing their hands because otherwise they don't know what to do with them. I recognized it because I did it too, but it's also been another stop. You don't have to finish the sentence, I said quietly. I think I might need to. The city noises, the afternoon light, the smell of the office that I had cataloged over 6 weeks without meaning to, coffee and drafting pencil, and the particular mineral smell of the paper rolls. I'm aware, he said carefully, of every professional and practical reason why I should leave this alone. My heart was doing something in my chest that I wasn't managing. So am I said. And I'm aware of them, and I find them all completely valid, and I have been sitting with this for weeks because I didn't want to impose something on you that you hadn't invited. He looked at me for a long moment. What makes you think I haven't been sitting with it too? The room was very still. The pencil was on his drafting table and the afternoon light was on the window, and my name was still in the air between us the way he had said it. Because you're better at not showing things than I am, I said. Am I? And now the edge of something on his face that was definitely a smile and was making it difficult for me to think clearly about professional distances or practical considerations. I've been leaving you drawings because I wanted to see what you'd find. I've been eating lunch at your window for 3 weeks. I called the section review specifically so you'd be in the room. I absorbed this. So the internship, I said slowly, was absolutely awarded on the merits of your application. His voice was firm on this point, which I reviewed along with 14 others. Your portfolio was the strongest. Full stop. A pause. The fact that your name made me look twice. I'll be honest about that. But what made me offer you the position was the work. Something released in me, something I'd been holding since the morning the email arrived, and I had felt the twin pull of gratitude and suspicion. Okay, I said. Okay, I believe you. He looked at me with that look I'd been cataloging for 6 weeks, and I understood for the first time that I hadn't been collecting data. I'd been keeping track of something I already knew. What happened next was not spontaneous. I want to be accurate about this. Nothing about Leonard Burns was spontaneous. He was a man who thought about things carefully, who drew before he built, who made decisions with a deliberateness that sometimes looked like slowness but was actually just the practice of someone who had been burned by haste enough times to respect the work of consideration. What happened was that we did not act on any of it that Friday. He said this needs more thought than a Friday afternoon. I agreed, because he was right and because part of me had needed someone to say it. We worked through the rest of the afternoon on the community center specifications, and the atmosphere between us was different. The same but known the way a room looks. The same after you've opened a window. The quality of the air altered even though nothing visible has changed. He left first at 7 with his coat and his portfolio and his half-cold coffee. At the door he turned back. Monday morning, he said. We're meeting with the client about the entry sequence. I'd like you at the table, not against the wall. The smile again, fuller this time. The smile I was going to be thinking about for a long time. At the table, Elmer. I nodded. I watched him leave. I sat in the conference room for 10 more minutes just being someone who was breathing and had a name and had apparently been seen across a conference table and hadn't fallen apart. The weekend was long. I walked a lot. I walked through neighborhoods I didn't usually walk through, looking at buildings the way you look at buildings when your nervous system is processing something too large for stillness. I thought about what I was doing. I thought about it with the care I gave to architectural problems, which is to say, I looked at it from multiple angles, found the thing that was wrong and the thing that was right and the place where the structure needed to be revised. What was right? Something real had developed over 6 weeks between two people who genuinely saw each other's work, genuinely engaged with each other's thinking, and had arrived at a mutual recognition that was not manufactured by circumstance but had grown from it. What required care, the professional context was real and needed to be navigated honestly. I was still his intern until the end of summer. The rest of the firm existed. Perception mattered, not because of gossip, but because the work mattered. And anything that compromised the work's integrity compromised something I cared about. What I decided, to be honest. To proceed carefully. To let neither the reality of the feeling nor the reality of the complication erase the other. By Sunday evening, I had stopped walking and was sitting in my apartment with the drawings I'd brought home. I had over 6 weeks accumulated an embarrassing number of drawings, mostly studies and sketches that Leonard Burns had left on my desk and that I had kept without examining why. And I was looking at them on my kitchen table. Each one told me something about how he thought, the thing he'd flagged as wrong, the thing he was excited about, the way his hand moved on paper, quick in early studies and increasingly precise as an idea resolved, the way he sometimes wrote a single word in the margin, always the word for the feeling of the space, not the technical term, wait, breath, pause, return. I picked up a pencil and added my own word to the margin of one of the studies, a section through the community center's main hall. I wrote, found. Then I put the drawings away and went to bed. The client meeting was at 10. I was there at 9 at the table with coffee and the section drawings and the entry sequence sketch that had started everything, and when Leonard Burns came in at 9:45 he saw me there and said nothing. Just took the chair at the end of the table and opened his portfolio, and the 10 minutes before the clients arrived were occupied by the particular comfortable silence of two people who are in the same room on purpose. The meeting went well. The entry sequence landed exactly as we had hoped. The client, a community organization director with sharp practical intelligence and the patience of someone who had been promised things before and was watching carefully to see if this time was different, asked good questions. And I answered some of them while Leonard Burns watched from across the table with an expression that was calm and attentive and told me nothing about the Friday afternoon that had preceded this Monday. After the clients left, Margot gathered her things and made a remark about the afternoon schedule, and Derek said something about the structural engineer's report, and the room gradually returned to ordinary professional midday. And Leonard Burns and I were briefly alone in the conference room again while everyone else moved toward the door. Good meeting, he said. Yes. He was collecting his drawings. I was collecting mine. Our hands were on opposite ends of the table and the same table. Are you free for lunch? He asked. He said it in the same voice he'd used to discuss the floor treatment, the same tone as everything else, and I understood that he was leaving me the choice of what to hear in it. Yes, I said. We went to the coffee shop around the corner, not the lunch place the rest of the firm used. A different one with smaller tables and the kind of mild controlled noise that gives you privacy by occupying the surrounding air. We sat across from each other with our coffee and the remains of our professional morning and looked at each other. I thought about it over the weekend, he said. So did I. What did you decide? I looked at my coffee, then at him. I decided to be honest and careful, in that order. Something in his face loosened, just slightly. The way a building looks after the formwork comes off, the shape you expected, the structure finally visible. I've been in this firm for 18 years, he said. I built it from the beginning. I care about it more than I care about most things, and I don't mean that as a warning, I mean it as context. My professional life is my actual life. I don't maintain clean separations. I know, I can see that in the work. What I'm saying is that I don't approach things lightly. I'm not casual about things that matter. His hands were around his coffee cup. You matter. And I'm saying that at full awareness of what I'm saying. I was 23 years old in a coffee shop with a man 15 years older than me who had just told me I mattered. And the thing I felt was not dazzled and not overwhelmed. It was something steadier than that. Something that felt like the right room for the person I was. I'm not casual either, I said. I'm going back to school at the end of summer. That's real. That's real. And I don't know what anything looks like past that, neither do I. A pause. I think not knowing is an honest position. I've always found honesty more comfortable than its alternatives. The edge of the smile. Yes, I noticed that about you early. We drank our coffee. Outside the window, the city was doing its midday thing. People and movement and the particular purposeful busyness that seems from inside a coffee shop to be happening in a slightly separate world. What I want, he said quietly, is to keep having the conversations we've been having, to keep working the way we've been working, and to see what else there is, if we're both willing to look. I thought about the weekend walk, the drawings on my kitchen table, the word I'd written in the margin. Yes, I said. That's what I want too. July moved through the way July does. Long days and sudden storms, and the building sites we visited where the community center's contractor was asking questions that needed answering on the ground. Leonard Burns and I visited sites together twice. I wore boots that were not quite right for construction sites, and he did not comment on this, though I noticed him clock it with the sidelong attention he applied to things he was filing away for later. On the second site visit, he brought an extra pair of boots in his bag. He set them down beside my feet with no explanation, and I changed into them, and we walked the site, and no one mentioned the boots, and the entire exchange had the quality of something understood rather than stated. This was how things developed between us. Slowly and with a great deal of attention. Nothing was rushed, nothing was assumed. We had lunch together most days at the Lightwell window or the small coffee shop, and we worked late together several evenings a week. And what grew between those spaces was not a performance of romance, but something more like a careful architecture, designed with intention, built in the right order, load-bearing, where load-bearing mattered. He asked about my family. I told him about my grandfather, the original Elmer, and the house that had been renovated 3 times. I told him about my parents, who were both practical people with a deep mystification at having produced a child who wanted to make buildings for a living, and who had supported this bewildering aspiration with the steadiness that is the highest form of parental love. He told me about his father and a 3-hour drive to stand in front of a building for 20 minutes. He told me about the year after his father died, when his mother had taken him to stay with his aunt in a city he'd never been to, and how that city had been full of buildings he'd never seen before, and how he had spent 2 weeks looking at them the way his father had taught him to look, and how that looking had been the only thing that had made grief make any sense. Architecture as grief work, I said. Architecture as making sense of things, he said. Not just grief. Everything. That's why you do it. Partly. He looked at me. The other part is that I've never been good at anything else. I don't believe that. It's true. I am specifically narrowly talented, and very little of that talent transfers. You're good at people. He looked genuinely surprised. I'm not particularly good at people. You're good at finding out what they're doing right and letting them know without making it into a ceremony. That's not nothing. I thought about the note he'd left on my desk after the client meeting. 3 words. Good work today. 3 words that had more information density than most feedback I'd received in 2 years of school. It's actually quite rare. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're surprisingly hard to deflect. I've been told. By whom? People who found it inconvenient. The smile came fully, and I had by now cataloged enough iterations of it to know that this one, slightly tilted, the eyes doing more work than the mouth, was the one that meant he was genuinely amused rather than politely so, and it did the same thing to my chest every time. The conversation that changed the temperature happened on a Thursday evening in mid-July. We had been working late on the community center again, the construction documentation phase beginning to demand the kind of precision that architecture school gestures toward but professional practice fully requires. Around 9, the project had reached a natural pause, and we had both leaned back from our respective ends of the table at the same moment. I need to tell you something, Leonard Burns said. My hands went still on the drawing. When I read your application, he said, I read it twice. Once the way I read everything, for the work, and once, and I want to be honest about this because your name made me stop. He paused. I had a superstition. I don't have many superstitions, but I had one that said if someone named Elmer sent me an application worth reading, I should pay attention. I looked at him across the drawings. That's a very specific superstition. Yes. Did you think you were going to find my grandfather? He almost laughed. Not literally, no. But I thought I was going to find someone worth the patience. And the name reminded me of something I've always known but sometimes forget to practice, that the things worth having require patience. I was quiet for a moment. My name got me the interview. Your portfolio got you the internship. He was clear on this. But your name made me read the portfolio to the end, when 3 others had already crossed my threshold, which means yes, if you're asking whether your name affected the outcome, yes, by the margin of a second reading. I had sat with this possibility for 7 weeks. I had arranged it as evidence and examined it and concluded that it made me suspect the whole thing. The offer and the summer and what I was building here in the spaces between work. And now it was named and on the table, and I was surprised to find that it felt smaller than I had been treating it. Okay, I said. Okay? I knew it was possible. I've known it since the email arrived. And I spent a lot of energy on it, and I'm putting that energy down now because the work is the work. I know what I've contributed. You know what I've contributed. That's enough. He looked at me for a long moment. That's very well adjusted of you. It took 7 weeks of not being well adjusted to get there, so I'd moderate the praise. I'll moderate nothing. You got there, and in my experience, that's the entire point. We looked at each other across the conference table, and the evening light, and the 7 weeks of accumulated knowing, and something solidified between us that I recognized as a new kind of foundation. Not the first thing, the recognition, and not the middle things, the careful navigation, but the actual structure, the part that would hold weight. August came in with heat and urgency. The internship had 8 weeks remaining, then 6, then 4. We did not pretend the calendar wasn't a fact. We talked about it with the same directness we applied to everything else. I would go back to my final year of school. He would continue the work of the firm. The geography was not ideal. The timing was not ideal. Very little that's real is ideal, he said once. This was not pessimism. It was the tone of someone who had built things in the real world and understood that ideal was a design phase concept that met the material conditions of existence and required revision. What we decided, and I'm using the word decided intentionally, because that is what it was to keep going. To keep the honesty and the attention and the careful building of whatever this was, and to figure out the details as the details presented themselves, rather than solving for obstacles that hadn't arrived yet. On the second Saturday of August, he asked me if I wanted to see a building. Not a firm project, not anything professional. A building in a neighborhood 2 hours north that he had visited years ago and wanted to go back to. I said yes. We drove with the windows down, which was his preference, and he played music at a low volume that suggested he was playing it for himself rather than for both of us, which was exactly the kind of company I found most comfortable, the kind that didn't perform for you. The building was a community library from the 1960s, a small masterpiece that had managed to age into its landscape rather than against it. Someone had added a reading garden at some point, semicircular, with a pergola structure that shouldn't have worked with the original building but did. We stood in front of it for a long time, not speaking, not performing the appreciation of it, just looking, the way he had described his father looking, with the attention that was an act of gratitude. Someone made that, I said quietly. He was very still beside me. Then, yes, we spent 2 hours there. We walked around it. We sat in the reading garden. He had a sketchbook, and I had mine, and we both drew without showing each other what we were drawing, which was the right kind of intimacy, present in the same place, doing the same thing, not required to share every version of ourselves simultaneously. When we got back to the car, he looked at what I'd drawn. I looked at what he'd drawn. He had drawn the pergola connection point, the junction between old and new, the detail that was doing the most work. I had drawn the reading garden from above, a plan view, an aerial fantasy, the kind of drawing that only makes sense if you already know the space. You draw from above, he said. I always want to know the whole picture first. I draw the seams, he said, where things come together. We looked at each other's drawings, 2 ways of seeing the same thing. That's probably important information, I said. Probably yes. He was smiling. I was smiling. The parking lot of a 1960s library in a town 2 hours north of the city was not an ideal setting, but it was a real one, and reality I had come to understand over the last 2 months was the only setting where anything actually happened. The last week of my internship arrived the way last things arrive, with a quality of heightened ordinariness, everything the same but observed more carefully. I finished the community center documentation. I handed over my project files with the obsessive organization of someone who wanted to be missed but not resented. I wrote process notes for whoever would pick up where I'd left off. Margot told me at a firm lunch on the Thursday that she hoped I would come back, and the way she said it, with the calm precision she applied to things she meant, told me she knew more about the summer's geography than I had directly told her. Derek was not at the lunch. Derek had been assigned to infrastructure documentation, and his particular quality of antagonism had become background noise. I no longer needed to translate. On the last Friday, I arrived early. Not 9 minutes early. Earlier than that, the office was still in its pre-day state, the particular quiet of a space waiting for its occupants, and I stood at the light well window in the intern workspace one more time and watched the morning move through it. I heard him come in at 7:30. I heard his office door, and the coffee machine, and the sound of him setting his things down. Then silence, which in his office generally meant he was at his drafting table. I went to his door and knocked. "Come in." He was at the drafting table as I'd expected. He turned around when I came in. His eyes went to the light well window visible beyond me in the corridor, and he registered that I had been there. And a quiet understanding crossed his face. "Last day," I said. "Last day," he agreed. I sat in the chair across from his drafting table, the one that had been my chair for 2 months of conversations, and looked at the drawings pinned to the wall behind him, the projects in progress. The section through the community center that now included the entry sequence and the threshold moment. "I want to say something," I said. "All right, I came here uncertain about why I'd gotten the offer. I spent the first few weeks looking for the evidence that I didn't actually belong here, and I found some things that looked like evidence, and I spent a lot of time with them." I looked at him steadily. What I know now is that the work is real. What I've learned here is real. What's happened between us is real, and none of it required me to deserve it perfectly from the beginning. He was very still. "I'm not going back to school knowing exactly what I'm going to become," I said. "But I'm going back knowing something about what kind of architect I want to be, and about what kind of person I want to spend time with. And both of those things have a lot to do with this summer." A pause, and then he did something he almost never did. He left his drafting table without the transitional stage of setting his pencil down, just stood up and crossed the room and sat in the chair across from mine so that we were simply two people at a normal human distance looking at each other. "I need to say something too," he said. "All right. I kept you here," he started, then began again. "I have kept extending your involvement in the project work because the work got better when you were in the room. That is a professional truth, and I'd have done it for anyone. But I wanted you in the room for reasons that stopped being entirely professional somewhere around week 2. And I was aware of that, and I made certain decisions, including keeping appropriate distance, and being honest with you about the complications when I named them. Because the fact that I wanted something didn't give me the right to pursue it without accounting for what it might cost you." I looked at him. "What it might cost me? You're at the beginning. I'm 15 years further along. Any power differential between us is real, even if we both choose not to use it as one. And I think," he stopped briefly, "I think you are someone worth being careful with, worth not taking advantage of by accident." Something in my chest was doing the thing again. The thing that I had stopped trying to categorize and had instead simply learned to allow. "That's the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me in the context of being interested in me," I said. "The bar may be low. The bar is not low. The thing you just did is just rare." I leaned forward slightly, "And for what it's worth, you haven't taken advantage of anything. What I've felt this summer, I've felt because of who you are, not because of any power you hold over me." "You're sure of that?" "I'm sure of that." The morning light in his office was doing its slow thing, moving across the section drawings, across the drafting table and the coffee cup and the two chairs across from each other where we were sitting. "I'd like to see you," he said, "past today, if you want that." "I want that," I said simply. "It will require some figuring out. I'm good at figuring things out." "I know." The smile. The one I've been cataloging for 2 months and intended to keep adding to. That's not a recent discovery. The summer ended and the year began, and the figuring out was actual work, as all real things are. We were 2 hours apart by train, which is a manageable distance for people who are honest about what they're managing, and we were honest. He visited my school twice. I showed him the studio, the work pinned to the wall in various stages of becoming the models, in various stages of falling apart, the particular culture of an architecture school that is simultaneously competitive and communal. Everyone making things at adjacent tables. Everyone aware of what the person next to them is building. He moved through it with his usual quality of attentiveness, looking at the work of my fellow students with the same calibrated eye he brought to professional work. And once, when he picked up a model a classmate of mine had left on the shared table and turned it in the light, she came back, to find him looking at it and asked, with the weariness of someone whose work is being assessed by someone who appears to know what they're doing, "What do you think?" "The section is stronger than the plan," he said. "If you lead with the section in your presentation, it does the work for you." She looked at the model, then at him, then at me. "He's right," I told her. She used the section. Her review went well. She came to find me afterward and said, "Who is that man?" "He's someone I know," I said, which was accurate and incomplete, and also, at that moment, the thing that felt exactly right to say. I came back to the firm the following summer, not as an intern. The conversation about that had happened carefully and with full transparency on all sides, including a conversation with Margot, who had the practical intelligence to understand a situation completely and the professional integrity to know how to hold it. I came back as a junior architect contracted with a clear project scope and an understood position. And the fact that I was also in a relationship with the founding partner was not a secret, and was not performed, and was simply the ground-level reality that the work sat on top of. It was not without complication. Derek, who had rotated back to the main projects, found something new to be cold about and deployed it with his usual precision. And I let it move through me the way I had learned to let such things move through me. Acknowledging it, declining to be organized by it, setting it down. Margot said to me once, in the direct way that was her mode, "You're good for him." I don't mean in the way people say that about partners to be polite. I mean specifically, you push back and he needs people who push back. He's been making decisions in too much of a vacuum. "He does the same for me," I said. "I know. That's what good looks like." She turned back to her drawings. "Now tell me what you think is wrong with this elevation, because I'm too close to it." I looked at the elevation. I told her what was wrong with it. She made a small acknowledging sound and started sketching the revision, and we worked for the next 2 hours in the particular companionable silence of people who are on the same side of a problem. The community center opened on a Wednesday in October, 2 years after the summer of my internship. It was not a grand opening. The organization didn't have the budget for grand, and the building itself, which was what it had always been, generous without flourishing, durable, beautifully ordinary, didn't need grand to say what it wanted to say. I stood in the entry sequence on opening day. The roof light was doing exactly what I had drawn it to do, sending a narrow line of sky down to the threshold, making the moment between outside and inside visible without announcing it. People crossed it without noticing, which is the best outcome for a threshold. You feel it without seeing the mechanism. Leonard Burns was standing across the main hall talking to the director, and he caught my eye at the moment I was looking at the roof light, and I pointed upward at the light without thinking because it was working. And he looked up at it too, and across the distance of the main hall something passed between us that was not a conversation, and did not need to be. Later, after the reception, after the director had said the things directors say at these events, and the neighbors had come in and already begun to use the space in the ways you always hope but never quite expect, we walked out into the October afternoon together. The building behind us, the neighborhood around us, the specific quality of October afternoon light that has a golden gravity to it, as if it's aware it's running out of year. "The entry sequence is right," he said. "Yes, it was right the night you sketched it." "Sometimes things are right early," I said. He looked at me with that look, the one I had spent a summer cataloging without understanding that I was keeping something, that the collection was itself a kind of answer. "Sometimes," he agreed, and we walked into the October afternoon, and behind us the building we had made together held the light to its roof light and let the people inside cross its threshold without knowing they were being given something. Someone had made that, two someones with a name between them and everything else besides. I have told this story to exactly one person other than myself, which is Margot, who asked about it over coffee one morning with the directness of someone who has never found indirection useful. "How did it start?" she asked. "The real start." "With a name," I told her. He read my name and stopped. And then I sent him the work, and the work was what it was, and he made the decision he'd have made for anyone whose work was what it was. And the name got me the second reading. The second reading got me the offer. The offer got me the summer. I looked at my coffee, but none of it made anything happen between us. That was something else. What was the something else? I thought about the conference table and the drawings on the desk, and the light well window and the library in the town 2 hours north, And the threshold moment and the two chairs across from each other on a Friday morning in August. Attention, I said. We paid attention to each other. And neither of us put it down. Margot nodded like this confirmed something she already knew. That's the only way anything real gets built, she said, and picked up her pen and went back to the elevation on her desk. She was right. She was almost always right, Margot. It was one of her most useful qualities. I went back to my desk. On it was a drawing Leonard Burns had left that morning. A section, a new project, something with a question mark in the margin where a detail needed solving. I picked it up. I looked at it with the full attention I had learned over a summer of paying attention to things, and I found the problem, and I wrote the answer in the margin beside his question. And I left it on his desk for him to find. That is how we have always worked. That is how we still work. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.